Alright, time for another draft physics video presentation. For what purpose? Again, unknown. These people are just impervious to reasoned argument. So, what's the point of making any reasonable argument? So anyway, the Pyrrho has made some piece of some sort of physics talk. It doesn't really have any scientific or rigorous explanation of anything. It's just mushy, blah blah. And I received an email from some kook, who starts off by making, oh, you believe something different than Ken Wheeler. Yeah, duh. And then he goes on to talk about meditation and how to, channel the vacuum energy and all this other mush. And it's like, people just, you really have no education, right? You don't know anything about biology or even psychology. We're just conditioned animals. You want to feel different, well, then you have to reflexively act different. That means you have to, it's like learning how to juggle. That's what the practice is, right? He calls it yoga practice. The practice is learning how to control physiology. And the only way you can do it is to recondition it. And the only way you recondition it is to practice. So it's like juggling or something. It takes time. And then you have to be very careful, because if you juggle in the wrong gravity, then your practice won't have any application to the real world. So if you meditate in a fake world, it's not going to do you much good, because it's not the real world. You have to make the real world into something you can practice, making acceptable, and you can feed on it. You have to learn to eat the poo, so to speak, if that's what you're living in. If you want to feel better, if that's your objective. Your objective is to survive and get something done, well, then you don't waste your time practicing, because it's a lot of work. It takes 7 years to learn how to, juggling is, the more things you juggle, the more years it takes you, to practice before you can accomplish the task. So it's you're not going to snap your fingers and say, gee, I'm a different person. It's not going to happen. It takes real work to change who you are. And real time, lots of it. Lots of time devoted to simply the purpose of making rationalizations to say everything's okay, to make you feel okay. Okay, it's just not going to be a simple thing to do. And it's just a biological engine, blah, 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 blah. There's no space you can interact with. There's no healing ghosts out there. I mean, people are it's just amazing gibberish. So, the Pyrrho has this little background image of little whales swimming through the little water, blah, 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 blah. All this fantasy bullshit that doesn't have anything to do with the grisly reality. You can take a beautiful picture of a puddle of poo. It could just be lit just perfectly. Just wonderful, wonderful picture. Doesn't mean it's good. Doesn't mean it's a beautiful thing. So anyway, so superficial. Anyway, back to physics. All right. So the physical reality is that we know certain things about the universe, right? There's certain phenomena, and they're really well established as phenomenon. And so I would argue that we know there's this thing called attraction and repulsion, right? So we know there's two kinds of things that happen. Things are a compelled thing. Okay, I'll write a couple of words. Don't like writing just because I'm not a very good speller. And anyway, so things can be moved towards and things move away. That's what we see, okay, all over the place. And that we know, kind of, that the thing that communicates this idea of go towards or go away is this stuff, this whatever, that moves the speed of light. Okay, that we know that all of this communicating that tells things to go somewhere, right? Not this stupid entanglement crap where it just flips, some kind of stupid flipping thing. Which, again, I don't want to give it any credibility. It's just nonsense. But anyway, so we know the communication between things happens by this stuff, by this mechanism that has a travel speed, and that's why there's a universe. Obviously, if the movement was communicated instantaneously, then everything would happen in one instant, and there wouldn't be any universe, right? There wouldn't be anything to experience, because there wouldn't be any place for the experience to take place. Time. So anyway, so we, that's all. The simple fact is we know there's movement, and we call that momentum, call it velocity, call it lots of things, but things change their position in space. They go from being here to going over here, and they do it first by communicating with some kind of mechanism that moves the speed of light, and that they will move much slower than something, something less than the speed of light. And all the things that we can establish as things, solid things, they all do this less than the speed of light thing in their movement. And so you could argue that this thing is just a communicator, and that this stuff has some sort of engine that moves on its own, but I would argue it's just much more sensible to say this stuff moving the speed of light carries the momentum. It is doing the pushing, and what we call pull, which I would again argue that, just as a fact, just as a, something we can understand if we put these two words next to each other and we say, provide example of push versus pull, that, all of your pull examples will have a catch to them. Where, I threw the rope over it and I grabbed it by the neck and I pulled it. Well, the pull is really going to be a push on the neck. You're not going to pull it, you're going to push it. Doorknobs, everything. You can just go and point out how, all the pulls look like they're actually just inverted pushes. You just change what's getting pushed. And so, another way of looking at this is you could say this stuff moving the speed of light is creating a kind of pressure in the universe, and that you have places where things are in, they'll have high pressure in one place and low pressure in another place, and so they'll more likely be pushed by the high pressure into the low pressure, and that things are just being pushed by pressure to move around and to be in certain positions. And that's one way of interpreting that simple problem, where you can see that pull doesn't really work as an answer. The universe is pushing, and and then we can see that in phenomenon like charge. So this is another thing we're quite confident, because we have lots of experiments demonstrating this function, that some of these basic elements that we've established exist, electrons and protons. Now they've put in 400 other kinds of wacky particles they say are also players somehow, even though they only exist for milliseconds of time, 0.00010 times the 58th seconds of reality. So anyway, I'm just saying, the real players, the ones that we can be confident about, is this idea of a proton and electron, and we know they have this inverse reaction to whatever I put here. So if I put X here, we know that the electron is going to be repelled, well then the proton is going to be attracted. We know the inverse is going to be happening. If I put the Y thing here, that the actual opposite is going to happen. And then we also know that the magnet does exactly the same thing. If I put two of these charges right next to each other, there's no one that can tell me that's not going to be exactly the same thing as a magnet. It's going to behave exactly like a magnet. It's going to turn, it's going to do lots of things in a field, it's going to do, so the magnet is the same thing. So we call this north and south, but clearly it's the same thing. So it's just the difference between separated these things and these things not separated. So the difference between a monopole and a dipole. And that's all the physics really leaves. We don't need to... Is there much more that we need to add to this equation? We have the speed of the communicating momentum. We have the fact that there's this inverse relationship, that somehow pull to one thing means push to another thing. That is, whatever one thing senses as low pressure, the other thing senses as high pressure, and they'll behave exactly opposite. And now all we have to do is explain how you can create these phenomena. And, what regular physics has done is taken these simple ingredients and then just pretended, no, I'm just going to deal with one of those at a time. I'm going to pretend they're all different things. So we have gravity, which is just this idea that you're getting pushed onto the earth, right? And then you have the magnetism and the rest of the things, and they're going to make these all separate functions. They're not going to say, well, whatever the mechanism is, it's all moving the speed of light, so let's find one mechanism that runs the speed of light. But instead, they're going to come up with a whole bunch of different mechanisms. And that's just sounds totally like failure. So they have this idea of, bent space-time, and then they have this QM thing. So this is the big universe, this is the small universe. I mean, you can just make a simple argument. There's only one universe. The small one. That's the only one. We know that everything happens in this big universe is being controlled by these little bits. The electrons and protons are doing all the work. If I move somewhere, I move because my electrons and protons moved. I didn't drag them along. They pushed me along. That's just logic. It's pretty reliable. So we know this isn't going to work. Bisecting the universe into two worlds, the small universe and the big universe, that makes no sense at all. I mean, it's not a viable theory of the universe's function, that somehow the universe has rules up here and then rules down here, and they're different rules, like there's some sort of different elemental bits, like somehow we're not a community of cells, like a human being. Let's pretend we're not just cells when we're just cells. Cells connected by highways and roads and mechanisms, and that everything I do is a byproduct of my cells doing it. I don't do anything. I don't have any function. I'm just an expression of a big blob, a big giant community of billions and billions and billions of cells. Would it be sensible for a biologist to think any other way? Somebody who examines humans and says, I understand humans. Would there be any point in understanding a human as anything other than just a community of cells? That each organ is a specific kind of cell with a specific kind of functions. It produces specific kind of chemicals for other purposes and other locations in the body and blah, 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 blah. Of course not. There's one universe, this one. And this is just, this idea they just ruined. There's mechanics, okay? And the mechanics is, you could argue, well, quantum makes sense because we know this little stuff that does all this moving at the speed of light is very discrete. It's got little bits to it, little clumpinesses. That's not hard to do. It's also not hard to figure out that waves are an emergent property. The ocean doesn't wave, right? I mean, the waves on the ocean are not the ocean waving. We know that there's a bunch of water molecules, and the water molecules are stuck to each other, and that anything that happens to one of them tends to happen to a whole bunch of them. And that's the reason why there's a wave, is because it's not sand. Because the sand doesn't stick to each other. You can't wave sand, right? Because sand isn't going to play by these rules. I mean, you can wave it if you put the force in underneath every little grain of sand. Well, then you can make sand look like it's waving. But of course, sand won't transmit a wave, because it isn't stuck to each other. I mean, these are just so basic facts, and it's just, you're saying, why should this it should be a non-starter to be talking about these kind of answers to questions when they don't cover any of the real mechanism, when they don't explain any of the stuff that's really essential to the function of the universe. It's obviously the wrong answer, and they just keep talking in these fairy tales as if, this somehow deals with any of the elemental, fundamental, in-your-face, well-established facts. There are well-established facts. Those should be the premises for the conversation, and the rest of this mush should be nothing. We should be way past saying this is a viable explanation. So anyway, so they have this stupid bent space thing that they always draw in these two dimensions, and mathematically, they don't know that this thing has, that there's no limit to how much they can bend it. So mathematically they have this problem of an infinity, okay, because their math doesn't establish any rule that you can't go any further than this. So if I was to say there was pressure in the universe because there was little bits of force, obviously there's only so many little bits, in a certain area, and that's all there is. There's not an infinite number. So once I use these little bits and hit something, that's all there's going to be. I can't make any more pressure than what the pressure is, right? There's no infinite well. So, we could sort of understand that there's nothing in our real world that implies the existence of anything called an infinity. That's just not practical. It's not going to work as an explanation because we have facts that indicate infinities don't exist. That it can't be the right answer because of the experiments just demonstrate limitations. So anyway, all right. So they have this bent space model, and so they want to just play this game using gravity that already exists, right? They're using gravity to explain gravity. They're saying there's this tendency for things to roll down the fabric hill. Well, where did the tendency come from? The only reason why it happens on Earth is because there's a force pushing it down. So they're saying, okay, we're going to explain the force pushing it down by just saying, for some reason, okay, the theoretical dimple in space is something that pulls things automatically. Stuff goes down because that's the rule. So even though there is no gravity, it just goes down because that's the way our line is drawn, and things move down the crooked line. So if I curve a line, things automatically move down the line with the magical non-energy that forces them to move down the line. I mean, it's useless. All right, first we know there's 3 dimensions in reality. There's not 2. There's no fabric in the essential reality. It doesn't make any sense. It's a non-starter as an explanation. So when the professionals teach it, unlike the pyrrhos, the professionals admit it's a convergence. Okay, and it's a perpetual convergence. It has energy built into it. So when people like Leonard Susskind teach the subject of gravity, they teach it as if it was a fluid, and there was an infinite waterfall. Okay, and you could just say the universe was the fluid behaved as if something you can't expand or contract. The fluid, so it's an uncompressible fluid, and there's a constant source. All right, coming in from the outside, okay, and the bits of matter, each little bit of matter is a drain, this little infinite drain, okay, where this fluid falls based on how big the hole is. So how much mass you have decides how big a hole you create in the fluid. So more fluid can go down, and you'll create more of these arrows. So the bigger the piece of matter, the more arrows, the more flow of fluid down the drain. And so that's how they teach it, right? They teach it by attempting to 3-dimensionalize, right? So drain, I'm already saying it's not 3 dimensions. Obviously their drain is in a 3-dimensional center, where it's going into something from all directions. So the exact opposite of the traditional light bulb example. Traditional light bulb is shooting rays out. And so this kind of light bulb, the matter light bulb, does exactly the opposite. It just consumes rays in. Okay, and they just go in, and they go in, and they go in, and they go in. And this creates high pressure out here and low pressure in that center, and that's where the flow goes, is where there's no pressure. And so that's how they teach it. Now, it's okay, you say fine if you want to make the universe out of fluid. You want to say space is some sort of stuff, and the stuff moves at the speed of light. That's how fast the fluid goes. And as the fluid moves, stuff floating in it will be accelerated by the fluid. By how much contact it has with the fluid will dictate how fast it can be moved by the fluid. So how heavy your boat is will decide how much it's going to be pushed by the fluid, and how deep it is in the fluid will tell you how fast it'll move into the fluid, move with the current. And then once you get it up to its terminal velocity, which would be near the speed of light, something near c, it won't go any faster. So once you get up to some sort of terminal velocity, that's all the velocity it's going to ever have, because it can't go faster than the wind. Like a sailboat can't go faster than the wind is blowing, unless you take advantage of the wind coming from the sides. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. It's not a perfect metaphor, quite obviously. So in this context, they've now they get rid of the bent fabric and they want to play a game, so now they call it foam. So what they mean by foam is it's in 3 dimensions. So if I was to draw 3 dimensions by just making things a different size, the foam is made of some matrix of foam, and some 3-dimensional blob of density, and that all they're saying now is that the matter bit has consumed some of the density. So it's taken bits of the foam and compressed them into a center. Okay, and again, it can do this infinitely. Okay, it can consume an infinite amount of foam and create a black hole. Blah, 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 blah. Anyway, but the rule is now, well, the problem with that example is that, well, once you've pulled the foam, once you've stretched it, it stops moving, right? So you've pulled little pieces of it from all points of the universe, very little pieces from the very far distance, a lot of pieces close up, and so you have very little foam here, and then more foam, and then more foam, and then more foam. So you try to create a pressure gradient in this foam thing, but again, unless it keeps consuming it, why does anything travel from heavy foam to thin foam? Because you say so? Oh, okay, it's just a magical rule. It just gains momentum because there's thick foam here and thin foam here. So you have to create some mechanism. You have to make the foam jiggly or something so that there's more jiggles in the thick foam and less jiggles in the thin foam, and so therefore it moves from lots of jiggles to less jiggles. Well, why create all of this nonsense? I mean, it might be able to explain, but look how complex it is, and what's the point of it? How does it serve a purpose? Because it doesn't really answer the plus and minus question at all. It doesn't go anywhere near explaining any of that. This foam explanation isn't going to work. What, does the foam also create little rays of thick foam and shoot them through the foam to the thick end or something? I mean, how do you... You're not going to get your inverse plus and minus reaction out of something with this explanation. We know there's something fundamentally different between these plus and minus things, these electrons and protons. Even though they both have this mass thing, even though they're doing this foam thing, they're somehow doing it in a very opposite manner. So why pretend this one answer works when this answer isn't going to work to explain the difference between these two objects? So again, they've just taken gravity and separated it out here and pretended they don't have to explain this here. And of course you have to explain this. Your explanation for this has to connect to this because it's elemental to the function. This is the thing creating the attraction and repulsion. Well, this is your this is the most outstanding example of attraction and repulsion. This you explain first. You don't do this. All right. So if I pointed out, gravity is just a consequence of this function, and the function is absorbing momentum. These two things absorb momentum inversely. What pushes one pulls the other. What pulls one pushes the other, so to speak. And the push and pull, as I pointed out, just means that you're taking advantage of a circumstance. So you have equal energy, and all you need to do to create a push is to remove one of these, and now you have a push. Okay, and I could remove this one, and then this one's still here, and so now I have a push that way. But you're just pushing from high pressure to low pressure. The universe is about gradients in pressure, and the key function is that the two elements are not somehow fundamentally the same. They're somehow fundamentally opposite each other. So you can't use one explanation for creating flow, because the two are quite opposite in their function in the same medium. So you have to understand the medium must have a trick to it. The medium must be doing two separate things. It can't be doing this thin foam, fat foam thing. It has to be doing something that can be interpreted two different ways by the same material object. And that means there really just has to be two kinds of pressure in the universe. There has to be something called an electron force and a proton force. You could say they're red and blue. There has to be red and blue light in the world, and there has to be the possibility of creating purple and all of that. It's the only way you can fix it. It's the only way you can resolve this with this. The only way you can combine this charge with gravity is to understand you need to make this mechanism, this ether has to somehow understand this difference in reaction. It has to account for it. Alright, what else needs to be said? I guess nothing. So I'll just play some of Pyrrho's. It's just such mush. It's so vacuous. It doesn't contain any connection to any of these physical phenomena that are well established to exist and why they exist. It provides zero explanation. And so let's just understand. All I'm saying is that you have something. We have this force moving the speed of light. It interacts with objects. The interaction means that the momentum of this ends up being trapped for a while. It doesn't get where it's going. This doesn't go here at the speed of light anymore. Instead, it spends time moving this much less than the speed of light. And then at some point, this might eventually creep its way here at 2 miles an hour. And it might eventually get where all of these were going. So it absorbed a ton of these. It kept absorbing these, all right, to acquire momentum. And when it arrives here, you're going to see all of this stuff, all of this momentum show up on this object, and there's going to be a tremendous release of all of this speed of light stuff is all of a sudden going to show up because it's here the whole time. It doesn't go somewhere. It just spends more time going around doing something when it's possessed by matter. So when matter has a velocity, when a piece of matter is moving, it's moving because somewhere in its past, little bits of energy, more of them hit it going one way than going the other way. And it traps them. So it traps them, and it trapped more going this way because more this way hit it. And so it contains a memory of that experience. It has been changed. So if you thought of it as a thing that had 10 components in it that had a direction, all the directions got changed to one direction, and then it can move very fast. Anyway, it's enough. It's just about things moving, going from point A to point B, and we're talking about the different things in the universe. And we know that one class of things all seems to move the same speed. That is, the class of things that create gravity, the class of things that create magnetism, the class of things that create charge. We know those things all move light, visible light. Those things all move the same speed. And they're very, very small and very discrete and very clumpy. And we know that a wave is an emergence. It emerges out of clumps. When groups of things clump, okay, they can be seen as a wave. Okay, but it's a bunch of discrete bits. The wave is emergent. It is not elemental. Nothing elementally waves. Waves are a consequence of this. Waves are a consequence of it's a group behavior. It is not an elemental behavior. Waving. Another so simple and so reliable deduction you can make. Alright, so let's play some of this drivel. So he starts the video with his stupid, idiotic 30 minutes of crappy music that who cares, and then he, I'm whatever, some kind of progressive liberal retard, and somehow he can't separate his subject. Somehow he can't figure out how to make a 20-minute video on, or a 10-minute video on physics and then make a separate video on politics. Instead, he has to smash them into the same video, which is just something overtly incoherent to do. It just doesn't make any sense. If you want to do things logically, you have to separate subjects. It's your obligation. You should make every effort to try, and he makes no effort to try.
That it relates because there is a subtext, not an ulterior motive, Ken. That's not the frequency. The frequency is subtext.
Frequency is subtext.
Oh, it's giving me an error. Well, whatever. Okay. Let's get started.
I have it sped up.
Space as a fabric. Space as a fabric. I think people don't understand this idea of space as a fabric.
Yeah, it's just words. It's just silly talk. It's just says nothing. A fabric that does plus and minus. A fabric that sends straight line beams of stuff in places. And then you're saying there's somehow waving there. It doesn't, yes, it doesn't make any sense at all. It's a silly way to... it's such a cartoon, right? And it's such a distant cartoon. It's like, there's some cartoon characters that are supposed to be something like a rabbit or a dog, and they don't look anything like a rabbit or a dog. I mean, they're terrible metaphors for what they're supposed to. Like Bugs Bunny didn't exactly look like any kind of rabbit I ever saw.
Okay, let's think about what this means. We're talking about the connection of space. And, of course, this idea is used. I mean, and that's where I'm going with this, is how and why it's used. And let's just start this way. I can be in this location, and I can move to this location.
Okay, the reason why it's being used is because it's childishly simple. And it lacks all connection to specific details or any of that crap. And again, it fits because we live in a world where you can bend a fabric and gravity will push things to go down the fabric. So that's the only reason. It isn't a good metaphor for any other reason than doopy, stupid, ignorant people will get some grasp of the notion of why something moves because of the hill and it falls down the hill. But it's pitiful as an explanation for the force of gravity. To use gravity, to explain gravity, is so lame.
Right? Could be here and move to here, or the other way around. Right? Over time. So let's, we're going to do a mental exercise where we don't assume too much. We don't assume too much about space. But we know that I could be in this location, I can move to this other nearby location. Or
I could move, yes. Like somehow I can do it. And I don't need a force to make me do it. So obviously what Newton discovered and other people is, unless forces act on things, it ain't going anywhere. It's not doing anything. Forces are your function. And everything functions by channeling forces. That is, channeling pressure. Forcing a bunch of stuff to go left instead of right or up or down. That it's just diverting the stuff moving the speed of light, because the stuff moving the speed of light is the messenger. What is a wave? A wave is a bunch of stuff and then no stuff, and then a bunch of stuff and then no stuff. What is it basically saying? I'm going to hit you with something real, and then all of a sudden there's not going to be anything hitting you. And then all of a sudden there's going to be a bunch of stuff hitting you, and then nothing hitting you. I'm going to hit you with pressure, and then no pressure, then no pressure.
Far away location given time. So time is the thing that allows me to translate. So I can.
So time allows something, like somehow I need time. When time is obviously just another one of the emergent things. It just follows that if something can't go any faster than the speed of light, that if something is taking time to do something, go from point A to point B, that now you've created time. Okay, you didn't need time to do it. Time wasn't some thing that you had to go find a bucket of time. Time is the resistance to change. And it's just built into the fact that the elemental thing, the thing we know is the communicator, takes time to go from point A to point B. If it didn't take time, there wouldn't be a universe.
Say if space was totally disconnected, this piece of space is totally disconnected. They were disconnected and non-continuously connected. In that case, I couldn't get over there, right? They have to have.
Of course you can get there. What's stopping you from getting there? If a force hits you, okay, it's moving, it hits you, why aren't you going to go there? How is space going to stop you from going somewhere? How does nothing stop something from moving? I mean, where's that rule written somewhere? I can't, it's not possible for you to imagine that the universe is actually made of nothing, like nothing, and that there's bits of something in the nothing. Do I have to create something and then say the bits are nothing in the something? Why do I have to do that? Why can't I just say there are somethings, and the somethings have properties, they have functions, and the function of the little force bits is they can go the speed of light, and the function of these bigger things is that they can trap this stuff, acquire a momentum, and move much slower. Nothing's stopping me from thinking that's the logical answer. There's no, oh, how do I move in empty space? It's like having, the perfect environment for moving. There's nothing in my way. I don't have to push a bunch of crap out of my way. Of course I'm going to move in empty space.
Have a connection. So the connection is time. So space, I can wormhole. It's just a word for using.
I can wormhole. It's just a word for an imagined pile of crap. That somehow the universe is actually some sort of bunch of flat planes all over the place, and that somehow I could take the plane of the universe and bend it in half and drill a hole through it. I mean, it's just baby talk. It doesn't have any factual evidence. There's no reason to believe it. It's just a fairy story about gremlins, the magical wormhole thing through the dimensions of space thing, whatever all those things are. Nothing. They're just completely made up fantasy stories. They don't have any reality at all. No evidence, no anything.
Time.
They're not even compatible with understanding the universe as a three-dimensional object.
To teleport using time to another location. Right? So not instantaneous teleport, that's impossible. But I can transport.
Again, on instantaneous teleportation to a different time in space. Oh, yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. You're going to a different time, but it takes you time to go to a different time. Oh, brother.
Myself from one location to another over time. That shows that they're connected, because otherwise I couldn't move from one location to another location. So they're connected.
Oh, whatever that means. So somehow he can't move if there's nothing in his way. Then this is a logician.
Well, when two things are connected, they have a connection. They also have a separation.
Well, gee, that's, when two things are connected, they're connected. Thank you. I wouldn't have figured out that correlation from the context of the sentence. It's good that you verified that connected things are actually connected.
Right? The distance between them, in this case, would be the separation. Also the separation in time because of the time translation. But let's just say the distance separation is also their connection. The space...
No, they're connected because they're not connected. Oh, that's so brilliant. I should have thought of that. Yes, that makes perfectly good sense. See, this thing being here and this space being over there, well, that's connected. Now, if this thing was right over here, they wouldn't be connected, right? That's silly. That's not being connected. No, connected is being away from something. You're automatically connected to that something by the automaticness.
Between the two is the distance and the separation. It's also the connection, right? Now, if there's no wire...
Well, we know that the connection is that a force has to migrate between the things at the speed of light. And that's the connection. Our connection to the sun. And, most physicists would agree if the sun instantly disappears, the Earth is still stuck in the pressure that it created because it takes time for the pressure to move. Both the light and the gravity and the magnetism and all those forces all take time to get someplace. So the environment we're in is good for 8 more minutes, even though the sun's gone. So for 8 minutes, we're not going to know it, because it's going to take 8 minutes for the information to get here.
Or anything physical connecting the two. Though I would say, anything that has physical characteristics is physical. But if there's no material substance, no mass connecting the two, They're still connected by, if they're in the atmosphere.
So again, they're connected by, if they're the same thing, then they're connected. If they're different things, they're connected. If they're connected, they're connected. It's connected. There's obviously, we know the connection is built out of radiation. We know it's built out of stuff that has momentum and goes from point A to point B. That's the connection.
But if they're in space, well, they're connected by space. Is that a connection? Well, yeah, a photon.
No, the space isn't a connection. So he's saying now a photon is space. So photon isn't something. It's part of this, whatever, the jello that somehow is connecting everything, the magic jello. And again, this will do nothing to explain the fundamental difference that what really makes things move distances is the charge force, the relationship between electrons and protons, the fact that electrons run away from each other, are pushed away from each other, and the fact that protons are pushed away from each other, and that there's this inverse relationship where they're attracted to the opposites. That's the fundamental mechanism.
It can travel from one to another, or the object itself can travel from one location to another. So their connection and separation is sort of the same thing, inversely proportional. The further they're separated.
Their connection and their separation are the same thing. I mean, how does anybody say this is a reasonable conversation? It's it's mush. It's the same thing. Connected and separated are the same thing. No, they're not.
Separated, the less their connection, and vice versa. But there is a connection, right? And it's a two-way connection. And that's what makes space like a fabric. Because a fabric is like that. This part of the fabric is connected to that part of the fabric.
Right, but there's absolutely no evidence that there is any such connection between photons. That photons are threads or ropes or any of that crap. That they have any obligation to be tied from one thing to the other thing. That there's some sort of wave that travels along the rope. I mean, this is just rope theory. Silly.
Okay.
There's every evidence. I stick something right in there, and I've blocked the force. I've blocked the pressure. All I do is stick something in between. The pressure obviously isn't on some sort of string. It's not on some sort of established pathway. I don't bend established pathways when I interrupt. I clearly interrupt by intersecting the pressure, by stopping it from getting where it was going.
Now, with a distortion of space, what we're dealing with is this problem that many people have noticed, that the idea of a tractor beam, right? A tractor beam, that you can put it on something and it brings the thing towards you, is hard to imagine. Except, of course...
Well, it's impossible for you to imagine because you don't have a real mechanism of force. You don't understand what's causing the pressure that makes something stay where it is or move this way or move this way. And what you have to do is create a change in the pressure. Now, we know having mass will do that. That means you're going to block field energy that was going to go somewhere, right? The Earth is absorbing a bunch of energy going a direction, and by absorbing that energy, the fact is something out here is not going to feel it, and it's going to be tractor beamed into it. Now, if you want to create a tractor beam that's based on gravity, well, that means the only way you can really do it is block a whole bunch of force. You're going to have to block a bunch of force the same way matter blocks force, and that means you're going to have to get something really big, really dense to create this. You're going to have to get some, Newtonium, Newtonium. I meant to say something even more bizarre, space-tonium or something. Some insanely heavy element that somehow you can shield yourself from because you don't want the tractor you just want the tractor part to go one way. There's no way to do it. It's the theoretical fact. So what's the point of talking about it? You can't do it that way. You have to use some other force.
You can do it with magnetism. Okay, so
there you go. You can do it with something like that. Yes, because you can shield yourself from magnetism. In fact, I can put a magnet in a steel ball and the magnet loses all of its function. And so I can point the magnet, and I can, but I'm still not I'm going to have one hell of a big fucking magnet, and I'm going to have to be sure that the stuff I'm trying to pull is going to be made out of something that I can magnetize, because until I've polarized the other thing, made it more charge of one size or one kind or the other, until I can charge it, I can't move it with magnetism. Till I turn it into an electron and a proton, or an electron or a proton, I can't do anything. I can't push it, pull it, do anything.
Magnetic object, or even a metal object that you could induce magnetism into, and of course gravity. Now, for some reason, it's really hard to imagine simulating gravity, even though it's been done in science fiction a lot, and it's fun to imagine.
Well, there's no point in trying to simulate it as a gun because gravity is, as pointed out, 10 to the minus 38 or whatever weaker force than magnetism or charge. So you're much better trying to do it with some sort of charge energy than magnetic. And the only difference is that obviously red light and blue light are really strong at moving electrons. Like the red light will move electrons tremendously powerful, and blue light will tremendously powerful move protons. But the trick is if I make it purple, if I mix the two, I don't do nothing. I can't push either one of them. And gravity's purple.
It's possible, but it's hard to imagine in a scientifically realistic way, at least for me, and I think a lot of other people. So that's related to the idea that, well, it's hard to imagine a tractor beam. And nobody's wanted to imagine a tractor beam. I believe even Newton didn't really like that idea of gravity as some force that could reach out and tractor pull you back. The whole point of Einstein...
Yeah, he didn't like the idea of pull either. Okay, he probably thought a little bit about push and pull and figured out that pulls just aren't realistic. It's way too complicated, pulling things. Pulling things doesn't make any sense. And obviously things do move from high pressure to low pressure. And so when you're seeing a pull, all you're saying is somehow I'm going to create a low pressure, okay, by creating a high pressure somewhere else. I'm going to create some imbalance in the pressure. And that the universe essentially runs on this push of creating a higher pressure. Without the higher pressure, there's no pressure. It's all about higher pressure. Where's the higher pressure? That's which way the object moves. If you can create an imbalance, more pressure one place, less pressure someplace else, it'll move. And what's the difference? The more part.
Using the fabric of space-time is that, well, we do have this fabric. We know that there's transitional, kind of, you can describe it mathematically. You can, translate yourself to anywhere in this space. But
you can do that by not creating a fabric. You don't have to create any of that stuff to mathematically understand that there's force in the field, and I can account for the force in the field. I can account for the fact that there's photons moving towards me from Alpha Centauri. They're already on their way, okay? And I can account for them mathematically without believing in any kind of bent jello.
It's a more of a fabric, is a physical metaphor. Well, we can imagine a fabric doing a tractor beam. It's not a tractor beam because the fabric is the thing connecting you. So if a table or if a chair is on a rug and you pull the rug, that's not a tractor beam, but you can pull it forward towards you because it's connected to the fabric.
It still doesn't save you from the point where if you try to do that with 1 electron's worth of fabric stretching, it's not going to be enough. It's not going to stretch the fabric enough to pull that thing over there. So somehow I'm still stuck with the matter equation. The matter equation says I need a whole bunch of matter to be able to stretch the fabric enough to pull the object. So it doesn't change any of the impossibilities that are quite obvious. You can't use gravity, okay, a non-polarized force, to move objects without involving a ton of mass.
And since space is a kind of a fabric, we have a potential solution for the tractor beam problem. Because space is now like a fabric. We're embedded in the fabric. And we can move, but we have inertia. That's sort of the resistance to moving in the fabric. It's not a superconducting space. No, it's a fabric. And though we can travel through it, or it travels through us.
So he's pretending that somehow he's dealing with the fabric, this idea of why it takes time, and that the fact that it does take time means there is resistance in the fabric, that we can't move instantaneously, that no force can act on us instantaneously, that it takes time for the little stuff to make the big stuff move.
It does exist. It's our coordinate system, right? And when you have mass, that mass would pull. The energy is just flying through the fabric. The mass, the energy is kinked up, and it's pulled the fabric. It's a big foam. It's a big foam in 3 dimensions. But it's like the mass is where the fabric was pulled and like stapled, glue-gunned in place. So around that mass, it's stretching the foam. If you get really far away, you won't.
So it doesn't make any sense at all, right? I mean, he could have said something like, no, the foam is the certain density of foam. And then what I've done is I've made some portion more dense by pulling the foam. And so I've made the foam around it less dense. And he's saying just by magical law, anything in the foam over here will somehow know that I'm supposed to go where the less dense foam is. Supposed to know it by some sort of know it rule.
Notice the stretching, but if you're close enough, you'll notice the stretching, where the foam has been stretched so that it's thinner, not as dense. The outer parts that are dense, well, if you get close to the edge where that lower density is of the foam, of the elastic foam that is space, if you're at the edge of that, well, it's denser on one side and less dense on the other, so you travel towards the less dense, just like any object.
All right, so again, I'll just point out, this is a silly way of creating push. The simplest way to create push is to make something moving, and that the moving thing hits other things. There, you've made push. BBs, whatever, ping pong balls in a sea of BBs. There, you've already created all of the mechanism you need. You don't need to create any of this foamy crap. You don't need all this jello crap. You don't need any of this stuff. It's completely superfluous. And the key point is, they can't make foam do plus and minus. They can't make foam do north and south. It's hopelessly flawed as a theory. They can't make it both high pressure, high foam, and low foam at the same time. And that's what your theory has to do. Somehow it has to have an element in it where the foam is thick to the proton and thin to the electron. So there has to be something in there that's both high pressure and low pressure, depending on the shape or the character of the electron and the proton. Clearly they're reacting, and they have to be reacting to two subtle differences in the foam. For some reason you have to say the electron goes from thin foam to thick foam, and the proton goes from thick foam to thin foam. But it won't work. You have to give your foam more than one dimension, more than one function.
Floating or any other sort of phenomena of relative pressures. And that's the idea that two things there. One, no tractor beam, right? It can be imagined. It can be hard to imagine in 3 dimensions for people, but it can be without just resorting.
Well, what the hell? Yeah, you can make up anything. I can imagine a gremlin. What's the point of me wasting time imagining a gremlin? A gremlin pushed it. I can imagine all kinds of silly explanations for how you can just make something move by wishing it so. So what? There's no physical evidence that any such thing is possible.
To an arbitrarily, the word 4th dimension, because you're in this fabric and you're stretching the fabric from the inside into a little kinky ball. That's the mass. Put a staple around that or clamp, and then the rest of it is being stretched right there in that foam. So it solves the tractor beam thing.
So this is like the worst physics video on the internet. I mean, there's lots of bad bullshit, but this is just as bad as it gets. It's just made up baby talk nonsense, not connected to anything real whatsoever. Any of the questions you actually have to answer, any of the phenomenon you actually have to explain. I mean, it's just fucking crap.
Because things in the foam are just working their way towards the less dense part, just like anything in a solid that over time is liquefied, where things can move around.
Yeah, I don't see anything moving around in an ice cube. I don't see anything moving around all the other kinds of foamy things.
And 2, it answers the question of how could there be infinite energy? I keep pulling these objects towards me, and that's infinite potential energy. No, you've just changed the shape, and now there's a downhill part, but it's not downhill.
Now there's a downhill part, right? So he's just saying, I'm just making up this rule that the stuff decides to move. Okay, it doesn't have to be motivated by something. You don't need any energy. It just likes to move this way in the foam. And so, yes, you don't need energy to move. He's basically just saying, I don't have to account for the energy because I don't believe energy moves things. I don't think you need a force to push it. I don't think you need a mechanism to communicate the fact that you need to move. I just make up this magical thing that happens where it says I'm going to move because it's detected foam absence. It's a silly explanation. I mean, he's just saying I don't have to worry about energy conservation because I'm making things move for no reason.
Hell, it's a pressure gradient. Easy peasy.
Yeah, it's a pressure gradient that doesn't work. It's not going to explain the pressure difference between electrons and protons. It's not going to explain how they interpret the same exact environment in completely inverted ways. So it's not going to work.
Space is a fabric. It works out really well when space is a fabric.
No, it doesn't work at all. It's first denying physics what it is, which is all of the facts have to be explained, not just a section of them, not just the atmosphere, not just the crust of the earth, not just, you can't just say, I'm just only going to explain this part of physics. Here's my explanation. It only covers this. I don't have to explain any of the other phenomena we know are facts. I mean, it's just so disconnected from your obligation. Your theory doesn't have any utility in explaining elemental function because it denies the existence of all the other elemental functions.
Now that segues right into the COVID response.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. You're crazy and such. So anyway, I think that was enough of a video. Snell's law, watching a few. Diffraction still remains it's clearly a surface phenomenon. Clearly the surface is causing it. And there's just no reason to think anything else is happening. And so here we are surprised that when light goes through a surface, it changes its angle. And now we're surprised that if we put the light going across the surface, instead of down into the surface, we put it across the surface, that there's a change in the direction of the light. Wow, big surprise. Not really. All right, so enough of this. But, I'm just demonstrating that these people are intractably disconnected from the real obligation of physics, which is to explain the whole physics, the real universe, not pieces of the universe, not their special section of the universe, not some other thing. The real universe. And the real universe is the small universe. The big universe emerges out of the existence of the small universe. We know that already. We know the electron, proton, nuclear atom thing is the thing. Okay, that's where the elements exist in. And that the atom's properties are dictated by the properties of the electrons and protons. We know that's where it starts. That's the world you have to explain. The rest of the facts will emerge out of that explanation. You get that explanation right, everything else emerges out of it. Talking to a smelly, stinking, dumb, ignorant wind.